All right, so we're diving into the world of GM Breweries today. You sent over a really interesting mix of their financials and regulatory filings, even some analyst discussions. So looks like you're trying to get the complete picture of this company,
It looks that way.
which, by the way, is publicly traded on both the National Stock Exchange of India Limited and the Bombay Stock Exchange Limited,
Yes, that's correct.
under the ticker symbols GMBRUW and 507488.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump in and see what we can uncover together.
GM Breweries operates solely in the country liquor segment in India, so that means they produce and sell spirits like whiskey and rum, but specifically those that are made in India.
Look, a little window into the world of Indian spirits.
Exactly.
Okay, so I've been going through these numbers, and the first thing that kind of jumps out at me is that uh, GM Breweries posted a net loss for Q3 of fiscal year 2025.
Right.
Not exactly what you want to
Sparked
see.
ideal, no.
But hold on, because the financials say this loss is linked to something called an exceptional item. Can you break that down for us? What does that even mean in plain English?
Sure, exceptional item basically just means something unusual happened that wouldn't normally occur during the course of their business.
Okay.
In this case, GM Breweries had an equity investment, meaning that they owned a piece of another company, and that investment lost value. So they had to report that loss, which impacted their overall profit for the quarter.
So it's more of a paper loss. It's not like they spilled a whole batch of whiskey.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
But it still affects the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
Which is ultimately what investors care about.
that's correct. Yeah.
Speaking of the bottom line, let's look at how their core business performed this quarter, starting with revenue.
Sure.
Did they manage to sell more this quarter compared to last year?
Well, their total revenue for Q3 FY25 came in at $1,388.42 million, which is actually down by 10.53% compared to the same period last year.
Okay.
However, it is up slightly by 1.04% from the previous quarter, Q2 FY25.
So a little bit of a mixed bag.
Yes, a little bit of a mixed bag. They're not necessarily shrinking, but they're not exactly booming either.
Right, right. So revenue isn't exactly overflowing. What about their expenses? Did those increase too? Because that would really put a squeeze on their profits.
You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, we do see an increase in expenses.
Okay.
Their total expenses for the quarter reached over $1,463.39 million,
Okay.
which is a 3.79% jump compared to last year
Okay.
and a 1.64% increase from the last quarter.
Right.
And while those might not seem like huge numbers, every bit of increased cost eats away at their potential profit.
For sure. Okay, so we see revenue is down year over year and expenses are up. That's not a good combination.
Not a good combination, no.
Were there any specific areas where expenses really ballooned? Give us the highlights, the things that would make you, as an investor, raise an eyebrow.
One of the most notable increases is in the cost of raw materials, which jumped to $919.41 million in Q3 FY25.
Okay.
That's a substantial 18.32% increase compared to the same quarter last year. You can see that jump in raw material costs is really eating into their profits.
Right.
And this is a trend we're seeing across the industry, by the way.
Interesting.
It'll be interesting to see how you as an investor think GM Breweries will handle it.
Right. If it's costing them more to make their products, but they can't increase prices to match, their profits are going to take a hit.
Exactly.
So taking all of this into account, revenue being down, expenses being up, especially raw materials, how did that ultimately impact their profit for the quarter?
So their profit from continuing operations, which basically means their profit from their main business activities before we factor in that exceptional item and taxes,
Great.
landed at $65.50 million for Q3 FY25.
Okay.
Now, compared to the same quarter last year, that's a significant drop of 42.40%.
Okay.
However, there is a silver lining. It's actually up 8.07% from the previous quarter, Q2 FY25.
So profits are down compared to last year, which isn't great, but they are up compared to last quarter.
That's right.
Definitely some volatility there, and it makes you wonder what factors might be driving those swings.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, let's take a look at some specific details related to their operations.
Okay.
The first thing that comes to mind is production volume.
Okay.
Did they mention how much they actually brewed this quarter?
Right.
I'm curious if they ramped up production or maybe scaled things back.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, the materials you provided don't give us specific figures on production volume.
Good.
However, we can do a little detective work here.
Okay.
Remember that increase in raw material costs we talked about?
Uh-huh.
Well, that could suggest that they're either producing more, which would require more ingredients,
Right.
or the cost of those ingredients themselves has simply gone up.
Right.
It'd be really helpful to see if their inventory levels have changed, as that might give us a clue.
Good point. If their inventory's piling up, it might mean they're brewing more than they're selling.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Was there any buzz about strategic initiatives or new product launches, anything exciting or innovative that GM Breweries is working on?
Again, we don't have any specific details about new initiatives or product launches in the materials that you shared.
Okay,
It's possible they didn't disclose that during their investor calls, or it just wasn't included in the reports you have.
fair enough. Sometimes companies keep those cards close to their chest.
Right.
Last question then.
Okay.
What about market trends in the country liquor segment?
Mm-hmm.
Any insights there?
Mm.
I'm curious to know if this market is growing, shrinking, or if there are any major shifts happening.
The country liquor market in India is definitely dynamic and evolving.
Okay.
Country liquor typically refers to spirits that are made in India, and it's generally a more affordable option compared to imported brands.
Uh-huh.
However, we're seeing a growing interest in other types of alcoholic beverages in India, like craft beers, imported wines, and even premium spirits.
Okay.
So this raises an important question. Is GM Breweries well positioned to adapt to these changing preferences?
That's a really good question. If they're only focusing on one part of the market, they could miss out on opportunities in these other growing segments.
Right.
It makes you wonder what investors are thinking about all this.
Yeah.
What do you think their main concerns might be based on these results?
I think investors will likely be looking for clarity on a few key things.
Okay.
First, how does GM Breweries plan to address the rising cost of raw materials?
Right.
Are they exploring ways to find cheaper sources for their ingredients or maybe adjust their pricing strategies?
Okay.
Second, given that revenue growth is a bit muted, what strategies are they implementing to boost sales?
Hmm.
Are they going to ramp up their marketing efforts, explore new distribution channels, maybe even consider diversifying beyond country liquor?
Right.
And finally, that loss on the equity investment might raise some questions about their overall investment strategy and whether they're making wise decisions with their capital.
All great points. So it seems like GM Breweries is facing some headwinds, but we also see some potential opportunities.
Yeah, definitely a mixed bag.
It'll be interesting to see how they navigate all of this.
For sure.
But before we move on to part 2 of our deep dive, let's take a quick recap of what we've learned so far.
Sounds good.
First, we saw that GM Breweries posted a net loss for the quarter, but it was largely due to that one-time loss on an equity investment.
Right?
We also saw that revenue is down year over year, while expenses are up, particularly the cost of raw materials. And finally, we discussed some key questions that investors might be asking about GM Breweries' strategy and future direction.
Exactly. We've laid a solid foundation, but there's still so much more to explore.
Love that. And remember, these financial statements are like pieces of a puzzle,
Yeah.
and we're putting them together to understand the full picture of GM Breweries' financial health and future prospects.
That's right.
So it's like we're on a treasure hunt, searching for clues within these numbers. And who knows, maybe our deep dive today will spark some ideas for your own further investigation. So be sure to join us for part 2 of our deep dive into GM Breweries, where we'll uncover even more insights and answer some of those burning questions.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into GM Breweries, ready to continue exploring.
Absolutely. We laid out some of the key numbers last time, but I feel like we're just getting started. When I think of breweries, I usually think about like craft beers, microbrews,
Right.
maybe even some experimental flavors. But GM Breweries is all about this country liquor. Can you explain exactly what that is and why they've decided to focus solely on that market?
Yeah, that's a great place to start because understanding country liquor is really key to understanding GM Brewery's position. So country liquor, sometimes called Indian-made foreign liquor or IMFL, basically refers to spirits like whiskey, rum, vodka, and gin that are produced domestically in India. And they're generally positioned as a more affordable option compared to imported brands, which tend to be a bit pricier.
So it's kind of like the local everyday drink for a lot of folks in India.
Yeah, exactly.
But we talked earlier about those evolving consumer preferences. Are you seeing any shifts in the market that might impact GM's focus on country liquor?
While country liquor remains a really significant part of the Indian alcoholic beverage market, it's true that consumer preferences are getting more diverse. I mean, think about it like this.
Okay.
If you were only offered one type of food for years, you might eventually get curious about trying other cuisines, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Same goes for drinks. People in India are getting more and more interested in trying new things like craft beers, imported wines, even those premium spirits we mentioned earlier.
Right.
And this growing diversity in the market, I think, presents both a challenge and an opportunity for GM breweries.
It sounds like they're kind of at a crossroads. Sticking with country liquor might limit their growth potential, especially if these other segments are taking off.
Right.
But on the other hand, country liquor is still a massive market.
It is.
So do you think it makes sense for them to consider diversifying their product portfolio at all?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer based on what we have here.
Sure.
On the one hand, diversification could allow GM to tap into those new and growing markets, potentially attracting new customers and boosting their revenue.
Uh-huh.
And remember those rising input costs we talked about.
Yes.
Offering a wider range of products, maybe even some premium options, could help offset those cost pressures
Right?
and improve their profit margins.
It's like having all your eggs in one basket versus spreading them out a little bit.
Exactly.
Diversification seems to make sense, but maybe there are some reasons why GM's hesitant to go down that path.
Yeah, good point.
What do you think those reasons might be?
Well, diversifying into new markets isn't as simple as just deciding to do it. It requires significant investment, expertise, resources. GM might need to develop new production capabilities,
Right.
establish new distribution networks,
Yeah.
build brand awareness in these unfamiliar markets.
Makes sense.
They might even need to acquire other companies or form strategic partnerships to gain a foothold in those new areas.
Yeah, so it's a big decision, and it comes with risks.
Definitely.
It's not just about brewing a new drink, it's about building a whole new business, essentially.
Right.
Let's shift gears a little bit and zoom back in on these financials.
Okay.
We talked about revenue and expenses, which are obviously crucial.
Yes.
But what about some of those less flashy but equally important figures like debt?
Okay.
Is GM Breweries carrying a lot of debt on their books?
Debt can be a really powerful tool for growth, but it's important to understand how much a company has and how they're managing it.
Right.
Unfortunately, the materials you've provided don't actually give us specific details about GM's debt levels. We'd need to look at their balance sheet to get a clear picture of their debt situation.
Okay, so that's a little bit of a blind spot for us.
Yeah, for now.
What about cash flow?
Okay.
That's always a good indicator of a company's financial health.
Oh, absolutely. Cash flow is crucial. It's the lifeblood of any business.
Okay.
A company can be profitable on paper, but still struggle if they're not generating enough cash.
Right.
However, just like with the debt, we don't have those specific cash flow figures in the materials you've provided. We'd need to look at their statement of cash flows to get a better understanding there.
Okay, so we're missing some pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But based on what we do have, what's your overall impression of GM's financial health? Are they in good shape, or are there some red flags we should be aware of?
Based on what we've seen so far, I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are both positive and negative aspects to consider.
Oh.
On the positive side, they are profitable, before we factor in that exceptional item, of course.
Okay.
And we did see that quarter-over-quarter increase in both revenue and profit.
Uh-huh.
However, those year-over-year declines, particularly that drop in profit, are definitely something to watch.
Okay.
The rising expenses, especially that surge in raw material costs, are also a cause for concern.
So it's like they're navigating a bit of a bumpy road.
Yeah, I'd say so.
There are some bright spots, but also some areas where they need to, be careful.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder what the experts are saying about all of this. We haven't really touched on the analyst perspective yet.
Right.
What are their thoughts on GM's performance and prospects?
Well, you've actually provided us with some interesting analyst discussion points, which is great because it gives us a glimpse into what those analysts are probably focusing on.
Okay.
And they're asking some tough questions.
Okay.
The same ones you might be asking yourself as you consider investing in GM Breweries.
That's perfect. It's like having a direct line to the experts, getting their take on what's going on with this company. So what are some of those key questions the analysts are raising? I'm eager to hear their perspective. All right, let's dive into those analyst discussion points. The first one that caught my eye is the impact of government regulations on the alcoholic beverage industry in India. I know there are tons of rules and regulations in this sector. How do they specifically affect GM Breweries?
You're right. The alcoholic beverage industry in India is super heavily regulated, a complex landscape to navigate. Each state has its own set of rules and taxation policies, and that can significantly impact a company's operations.
So, like a change in regulations in one state could really throw a wrench in their plans.
Exactly. Think of it like a patchwork quilt, each state having a different patch. For GM breweries, this means they need to comply with all sorts of regulations, related to production, distribution, pricing, even marketing.
Are there any specific examples of how these regulations might impact GM Breweries' bottom line?
Oh, absolutely. Let's say the government decides to increase excise duties on alcoholic beverages. That directly impacts GM's profitability because they'd either have to absorb those higher costs or pass them on to consumers, right?
Right,
By raising prices.
right.
And remember, they're operating in a price-sensitive market.
Yeah.
So raising prices could affect their sales volume.
Makes sense.
Similarly, changes in licensing requirements could make it harder to expand. If GM Breweries wants to enter a new state, they need to get the necessary licenses, which can be time-consuming and costly.
So it's not just about brewing good drinks, it's about navigating this whole regulatory maze.
Exactly. Adds another layer of complexity to their business.
Right. The next point on the list is competition. Who are the big players in the country liquor market, and how does GM Breweries stack up against them?
The country liquor market in India is pretty fragmented, meaning there are lots of players, big and small, competing for market share.
Okay.
Some of GM's key competitors include companies like Radico Khaitan, United Spirits, Tilak Industries.
Right.
These are all well-established companies with their own strengths and strategies. And then you've got, tons of smaller regional players that are also competing for a piece of the pie.
So it's a crowded field. What sets GM Breweries apart? What's their unique selling proposition?
That's what investors are going to be trying to figure out.
Yeah.
They want to understand how GM is differentiating itself in this competitive market.
Right.
Are they offering something unique? Are they known for quality or pricing? Do they have a strong distribution network? Or maybe they've got a really effective marketing campaign that really connects with consumers. All these factors can help a company stand out, attract loyal customers.
Makes sense. Give people a reason to choose your product, right?
Exactly.
Okay, last point from the analysts is about economic conditions. How is the overall economic climate in India impacting GM Breweries?
Here's where we need to think about those big picture economic factors, those that can influence consumer behavior. So India's economy has been growing steadily, which is usually good for businesses, right?
Right.
But there are always challenges. Take inflation, for example. When prices go up, people have less money to spend on, things they want, like alcoholic beverages.
Right.
This could impact demand for country liquor especially, since it tends to be the more price-sensitive consumers buying it.
Right. Even if people still want to enjoy a drink, maybe they switch to cheaper brands or just buy less if their wallet's feeling a little tight.
Exactly. And that's not good for GM.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if the economy's booming, people have more disposable income, that could create a much better environment for GM,
Yeah.
Consumers might be more willing to stick with the brands they like or even trade up to slightly more premium options. So their performance is kind of tied to how well the economy's doing overall.
It's all connected. We've covered a lot of ground here, from really diving deep into their financials to all these broader market dynamics.
It's a lot.
Any final thoughts on GM Breweries before we wrap things up? What's the key takeaway for our listener today?
I think the main takeaway is that GM Breweries is at a really interesting point. They've established themselves in this country liquor market, but things are changing.
Right.
They're facing challenges, evolving consumer preferences, rising costs, intense competition. It'll be fascinating to see how they navigate those challenges and capitalize on the opportunities out there.
Almost like they're standing at a fork in the road.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
decisions they make now are going to determine their path.
Exactly. Will they stick with country liquor or will they diversify? How will they deal with those cost pressures? How will they reignite revenue growth? These are all questions investors will be looking for answers to.
It's a good reminder that financial statements are more than just numbers on a page.
Oh, for sure.
They're clues that help us understand a company's story, their challenges, their potential.
And that's what makes it so interesting, solving a puzzle, piecing it all together.
Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about today. Thanks so much for guiding us through this deep dive into GM Breweries.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found this informative and insightful. Remember, we're always looking for new companies to, take apart. So if you have any suggestions, send them our way. Until next time, happy investing.